I was 43 years old when I realized that Marcus had never intended to marry me. The understanding came not with dramatic revelation or tearful confession, but with the quiet accumulation of small truths I'd been refusing to see. It happened on a Sunday morning in September, as I sat at my kitchen table sorting through a showbox of old letters and photos, trying to decide what to keep and what to finally throw away. The showbox had been sitting in my closet for 2 years, untouched since Marcus moved out. Inside were 17 years of our relationship compressed into paper memories, birthday cards, vacation photos, restaurant receipts from special dinners, and folded notebook pages covered in his careful handwriting. I pulled out a letter he'd written me during our second year together, when I'd gone to visit my sister in Portland for a week. His words were sweet, romantic, full of the kind of promises that 28-year-olds make when they're drunk on love and certainty about the future. "I can't wait to marry you, Emma," he'd written. "I can't wait to build a life with you, to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I think about our wedding sometimes, about how beautiful you'll look, about how happy we'll be. Soon, I promise. As soon as I get the promotion, as soon as we save more money, as soon as the timing is right." As soon as, 2 words that had become the soundtrack of our 17-year relationship. I set the letter aside and reached for another one, this one from 5 years later. Another promise, another as soon as he finished his MBA, as soon as we found the perfect house, as soon as his mother got used to the idea. Then another letter from year 10, same promises, different conditions. As soon as his career stabilized, as soon as my business took off, as soon as we figured out the financial logistics. 17 years of as soon as, and I was sitting in my kitchen at 43, unmarried, childless, starting over from scratch because I'd finally realized that as soon as was Marcus's way of saying never without having to break my heart all at once. I opened my laptop and did something I'd been avoiding for months. I looked up Marcus's social media profiles. He'd been careful about his privacy settings while we were together, said he didn't like mixing his personal and professional lives online, but now apparently, he'd relaxed those restrictions. The first photo I saw made my hands shake. Marcus standing on a beach at sunset, his arm around a woman with short blonde hair and a radiant smile. She was wearing a simple white dress. He was in a linen shirt I didn't recognize, and they were both looking at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from having just made a life-changing decision. The caption read, "She said yes. Can't wait to spend forever with my beautiful fiancée, Jessica. Thank you to everyone who helped make this proposal perfect." The post was dated 3 months ago, 3 months after our breakup. I scrolled through more photos. Marcus and Jessica at a wine tasting. Marcus and Jessica with his parents. The same parents who had told me for 17 years that they wanted to wait until we were married before considering me real family. Marcus and Jessica at a concert, a baseball game, a dinner party with friends. In every photo, Marcus looked happier than I'd seen him in years. Not the careful, measured happiness he'd shown me, the kind that always seemed contingent on conditions being met and circumstances aligning. In every photo, Marcus looked happier than I'd seen him, and this was uninhibited joy, the kind of happiness that comes from knowing exactly what you want and going after it without hesitation. Years, not the careful, measured happiness he'd shown me, the kind that always seemed contingent on conditions being met and circumstances aligning. I found the proposal photos. A professional photographer had captured the moment on the same beach where Marcus and I had vacationed 2 years earlier. He'd gotten down on one knee in front of the same restaurant where he'd once told me we should wait until we were more financially stable before making such big decisions. The ring was beautiful. The kind of ring I'd pointed out in jewelry store windows for years, while Marcus made comments about how much engagement rings had inflated in price, how smart couples focused on practical investments rather than expensive symbols. He'd bought Jessica the exact kind of ring he'd spent 17 years telling me was a waste of money. I closed the laptop and sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a relationship that had consumed nearly half my adult life, and tried to process what I was feeling. Not heartbreak, exactly. I'd processed the heartbreak over the past 2 years. Not surprised, part of me had always suspected this day would come. What I felt was something closer to recognition. The sharp, clear understanding that I'd been living in a fantasy for 17 years. Marcus hadn't been working toward marrying me. He'd been buying time, keeping me as a placeholder while he figured out what he really wanted. And what he'd really wanted, apparently, was someone who wasn't me. I thought about all the conversations we'd had about our future, how we'd talk about wedding plans in hypothetical terms if we got married, when we got married, after we got married. I'd interpreted those conversations as planning. Marcus had apparently been using them as a way to placate me without actually committing to anything. I thought about the house we'd bought together 3 years ago, how excited I'd been to finally take that step, how it had seemed like proof that we were building something permanent, how Marcus had insisted on keeping the deed in his name alone for tax purposes and until we're married. I thought about the conversations with my friends where I defended our timeline, explained why we were taking things slowly, insisted that not everyone needed to follow conventional relationship milestones, how I turned into Marcus's advocate, arguing against my own desires because I believed his reasons were more logical than my feelings. I thought about my sister's wedding 5 years ago, when I'd caught the bouquet and everyone had cheered and looked at Marcus expectantly, how he'd smiled and shrugged and said, "Pressure, pressure," in a tone that suggested the whole tradition was silly and outdated. I'd laughed along with everyone else, but that night in our hotel room, I'd asked him when he thought we might get engaged. "Why do we need to put a timeline on everything, Em?" He'd said. "We're happy. We love each other. Why do we need a piece of paper to validate that?" It was a conversation we'd had dozens of times over the years, always ending with me agreeing that love was more important than legal documents, that we didn't need society's approval to know our relationship was real. But looking at Jessica's engagement photos, I realized that Marcus had never been opposed to marriage as an institution. He'd been opposed to marrying me. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was my best friend Rachel, calling for our regular Sunday check-in. "Hey," she said, "how are you doing?" I saw Marcus's engagement photos. A pause. "Oh, honey, I'm sorry. How are you feeling?" "Confused mostly." "Rachel, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course." "Did you always think he was going to leave me?" Another pause, longer this time. "Emma, tell me the truth. I need to hear it." "I thought he was keeping his options open," she said carefully. "I thought he loved you, but I also thought he was waiting to see if something better came along." The words hit me like a punch, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you were happy. Because you believed in him, in your future together. Because I hoped I was wrong." "But you weren't wrong." "No, I don't think I was." After we hung up, I went back to the showbox and started reading through Marcus's letters more systematically, looking for patterns I'd missed the first time around. What I found was fascinating and heartbreaking. Over 17 years, Marcus's promises had remained remarkably consistent in their vagueness. He always talked about marrying me someday, about our eventual wedding, about the life we'd build when the time was right. But he never talked specifics, never mentioned actual dates, concrete plans, real steps toward the altar. Even his most romantic letters were carefully worded to express love without commitment, desire without intention. I'd read those letters as evidence of his deep feelings for me. Now I read them as evidence of his skill at saying what I wanted to hear without actually promising anything he'd be held accountable for later. The most devastating discovery was a pattern I'd never noticed. Over the years, Marcus's conditions for marriage had kept changing. Every time we met one milestone, he'd set saving money, buying a house, getting promotions. He'd introduce new requirements. It was like a game where the finish line kept moving further away, but the game was designed to look like progress was being made. I remembered a conversation we'd had about 5 years ago. After we'd finally saved the amount of money Marcus said we needed for a proper wedding. "I'm thinking we should wait until after your dad retires," he'd said. "It would be less stressful for your family if they didn't have to worry about taking time off work." It had sounded thoughtful, considerate. I'd agreed that we should wait. Now I realized it was just another delay tactic. Another way to push the decision further into the future without having to admit he didn't want to make it at all. 2 hours later, I was still sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of 17 years of sophisticated procrastination, when I made a decision that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I was disappointed, certainly. Sad about the time I'd lost, the opportunities I'd missed while waiting for a future that was never going to materialize. But I wasn't angry at Marcus for misleading me. I was angry at myself for allowing it to happen. Because the truth was, there had been signs all along. Not dramatic red flags, but subtle indicators that Marcus was more committed to the idea of our relationship than to actually deepening it. The way he never wanted to talk about specific wedding details, always redirecting conversations about marriage toward general discussions about love and commitment. The way he'd never introduced me to his colleagues at work events, saying he preferred to keep his personal and professional lives separate. The way he'd always had logical reasons for postponing major decisions, not just marriage, but everything from adopting a pet to planning long vacations to combining our finances. The way he'd somehow never been quite ready for any of the steps that would have made our relationship more permanent, more public, more difficult to walk away from. I'd seen all of these things, but I'd chosen to interpret them charitably. I'd told myself that Marcus was careful, thoughtful, responsible, that he wanted to make sure we were making decisions for the right reasons. I'd been so invested in the story I'd created about our relationship that I'd ignored the story Marcus was actually telling me through his actions. That evening, I called my sister in Portland. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to not say I told you so." "Okay," Sarah said carefully. "What's going on?" "Marcus got engaged to someone else 3 months after we broke up." "Sarah? I'm here. I'm just processing that." "I know. I've been processing it all day." "How are you feeling?" "Like an idiot. Like I wasted 17 years of my life waiting for something that was never going to happen." "Emma, you didn't waste 17 years. You loved someone. You built a life with someone. That's not nothing." "But it wasn't what I thought it was." "No," Sarah said gently, "it wasn't." We talked for 2 hours, about the signs she'd seen but hadn't wanted to mention, about the conversations our parents had had about whether Marcus was ever going to propose, about the way I'd defended the relationship to everyone, including myself, for years. "The thing is," Sarah said near the end of our call, "I think part of you knew. I think you've known for a while that something wasn't right. You're too smart not to have seen the patterns." But I'd silenced that part of myself because accepting its truth would have meant admitting that I'd built my life around someone else's false promise. A week later, I ran into Marcus's mother at the grocery store. Linda had always been polite to me but distant, never quite warming up despite 17 years of holidays and family dinners. "Emma," she said, looking uncomfortable, "how are you?" "I'm well, thank you. Congratulations on Marcus's engagement." "Oh," she looked surprised that I knew. "Thank you. Jessica is lovely." "I'm sure she is." We stood there for a moment in the produce section, two women who'd shared 17 years of family occasions but had never really connected. "Linda, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did you ever think Marcus was going to marry me?" She looked startled by the directness of the question. "Emma, I'm not upset. I just want to understand." Linda considered this, then sighed. Honestly? No, I don't think I did. Marcus always talked about you like you were temporary, even after all those years. Like he was keeping his options open. Did that concern you? It concerned me for you, she said quietly. You seemed to love him more than he loved the idea of being with you. The distinction was small but crucial. Marcus had loved the idea of being with me, the companionship, the stability, the comfort of a long-term relationship. But he'd never loved me enough to choose me definitively, permanently, publicly. 6 months later, I was cleaning out my closet when I found Marcus's engagement ring to me, the one he'd bought but never given me, hidden in a sock drawer for 3 years while he waited for the right moment that apparently never came. I'd found it by accident 2 weeks before our breakup, tucked behind his winter socks in our shared dresser. When I'd confronted him about it, he'd said he was waiting for a special occasion, waiting for the timing to be perfect. Now, holding the ring in my hand, I realized it was probably a backup plan. Something he could produce if I ever gave him an ultimatum. If I ever forced the issue. A way to buy more time without having to actually go through with a wedding. I took the ring to a jewelry store and had it appraised. Then I donated the money to a women's shelter to help other women who might be rebuilding their lives after realizing that love isn't always enough. A year after Marcus's engagement, I started dating again. Not because I was over him, that had happened much earlier than I'd expected, but because I'd finally learned to recognize the difference between someone who wanted to be with me and someone who wanted the idea of being with me. The first man I dated seriously was David, a divorced father who talked about the future in concrete terms. When he said we should plan a weekend trip, he pulled out his calendar and picked dates. When he said he wanted me to meet his daughter, he arranged a specific dinner. When he said he loved me, he followed it up with actions that demonstrated what that love meant to him. David proposed after 8 months of dating, not because our relationship was more intense than what I'd had with Marcus, but because David was ready to choose a partner and build a life with intention rather than hoping circumstances would make decisions for him. I said yes, not because I needed to be married, but because I'd learned the difference between someone who promises you a future and someone who actively creates one with you. At our wedding, small, simple, exactly what both of us wanted, I thought about Marcus and Jessica, who had probably married by then. I hoped they were happy. I hoped Jessica had gotten the version of Marcus who was ready to commit, who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to choose it. But mostly, I was grateful that I'd finally learned to trust my instincts about what real love looked like. It wasn't grand promises about someday. It was someone showing up consistently, making decisions together, building something real instead of just talking about it. Marcus had taught me something valuable, just not what he'd intended to teach me. He'd taught me that some promises are meant to be kept, and some promises are meant to buy time. The trick is learning to tell the difference before you've wasted 17 years of your life waiting for as soon as to finally arrive.
Some stories are felt, not spoken. If unsaid stories moved you even a little, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support helps these unsaid stories find their voice